A lot of these apply to things that we've covered generally already. These are going to be things that you've heard before, you've heard me talk about, you've heard in presentations, but we're specifically applying them to type design in this case. Obviously, they pretty much relate to everything that we've been talking about, but there we go. Things like hierarchy, alignment, balance, contrast, proximity, repetition. We've talked about all of these things. Again, an example of, obviously a poor example on purpose, but using way too many fonts in the design, all that fun stuff. Don't use too many fonts. It's way too distracting, and it looks bad. An appropriate use of type, generally 2 to 3 complementary fonts. They can be serif versus sans serif, you know what I mean? But 2 fonts that kind of go together, generally 2 to 3, give or take. Again, not a hard and fast rule. This is actually 1 font and just a variety of different sizes and treatments. So you have like an extra bold versus a thin versus maybe an ultra, and then even these might be exactly the same, just different sizes. But again, very significant changes, right? Even if it's the same font, as you make significant changes, you can start to see how a hierarchy forms, right? So you have the hierarchy, bless you, you have the hierarchy with what it is, bless you, with what it is, and effectively here, you know that it's a free day, where it is, and then some basic information, all that good stuff, right? So you start to see how a hierarchy establishes. You start to see how you can design something that's effectively, decent looking and use 1 font, but a variety of different treatments, right? So again, talking about hierarchy is basically just how you rank each design element by importance, right? And not that if you're putting out a flyer or if you're even making a business card, something like that, if you're making a composition, obviously everything in the composition is important. So we don't mean like important in the grand sense of things, but you can decide sort of what's more important by establishing this hierarchy. So we have here, this is not designed at all, obviously, but some dummy info for a basic event, right? How do we apply a hierarchy to it so it looks visually pleasing but also makes sense, right? We have our event name, the who, what, when, where, why. We have the event name, potentially a tagline, the date and location, and then any other kind of info that may or may not be, again, not that it's not important, but if someone just read this top part and they're going, then they don't necessarily need to read the short description part. But again, a good example of a basic hierarchy. We've talked about alignment already earlier this semester. Generally, we've talked about static versus dynamic, but in this case, we're going to be talking about alignment with objects and how they relate to each other on a page. So, for example, we have this block of text and even this smaller block of text, all left justified, but we're still creating a dynamic layout. If we were to have this, even if it was still left justified, but more centered in this design, even a little bit smaller, just dead center, we're creating a little bit more of a static design, right? When we talked about static versus dynamic. But having generally everything left justified, and then again going along with this graphic to kind of pull your eye through the piece. And then we have a really nice balance between positive and negative space, which we'll get into. And then here's another sort of more dynamic version of mixed justifications, right? So we have a right justification here, and then this nice simple graphic leading us down to a left justification. But again, sort of brings your eyes through the piece. And then we have this nice illustration, and then balanced by, there's some good visual balance with the negative space here, balanced by the positive space here. But varieties of different alignments and how they relate to other elements on the page or within your composition can, again, I know I keep saying it every single presentation, but can lead the viewer's eye through the piece, right? Balance, we've talked about balance before. Again, design elements carry visual weight. Darker colors have more visual weight than lighter colors, etc. So this is relatively new, or we just covered it, I should say. So not necessarily new information, but fresh information. So we have a balanced design here, even though technically the left and the right are different, but overall visually we have a nice visual symmetrical balance. And then here we have examples of asymmetrical balance, but how we visually balance these design elements, right, in 3 different ways effectively, but keep a relative overall compositional balance, right? There's this large block of text. Personally, I probably would have made this block of text maybe not all caps. I get kind of what they were doing, but I feel like that's a little bit cluttered. But they're balancing the white space, positive, negative space, and this visual space here, but effectively keeping the visual space of all three pieces relatively similar with a variety of different sizes of text, right? So we have less text here, so obviously we need to make it a little bit bigger so it carries more visual weight. And then here we make it a little bit smaller, etc. Contrast, again, sort of like choosing fonts. If you're going to have something contrasting, make it contrasting, either by size. So like in this case, these two circles are very, very different in size, but they're also very similar in color. So if you had two elements that were about the same size and you had these two color yellows, while they're technically different, personally, I would feel like there's not enough contrast, right? If you're going to have contrast, like make it a contrast, right? So here we have a variety of different contrasts. The contrast between this nice clear product shot versus the background shot, a clean photo versus the sort of distressed background, lots of texture versus sort of minimal texture, a whole lot of different contrasts going on to create overall visual interest. And then we have a font that kind of goes along with the background, that sort of distressed, letterpressed kind of font. And then here we have a sort of cleaner example of contrast where we have, again, the different sizes between these two elements and the middle element, but generally the visual contrast between the foreground and background, the figure ground, right? We have a nice visual balance, again, with the larger block of a lighter color. These smaller, darker elements carry just about the same amount of visual weight, right? Proximity, we've talked about this a little bit. Basically grouping things together, grouping like items so it's obvious to the viewer that they're related, right? So we've talked about this with objects and how they relate to each other. In this case, with text, we have sort of this group of objects. While they're different sizes, they're all the same color, they're all right justified, so it's pretty clear. I mean, it's also one page, so it's a little bit more obvious, but it's clear that these elements will relate to each other. And then again, these elements will relate to each other, being the same size, same color, etc. And we've talked about this, where like objects can also relate to multiple things at the same time. So these four pink elements, even though one is text, will relate to each other because they're both pink. But the circle will relate to the pink object as well as the navy circles because they're all circles. So that's something that you can use as well, with which is technically proximity. But basically, how do your objects in your composition relate to each other? Repetition. So repeating certain characteristics, fonts, colors, layouts, design elements, etc., will keep your overall design cohesive, right? This is really important when we talk about branding specifically. So you can see here, we have our logos on our letterhead, on our business card, on our envelopes. And then the examples I have is our good old Orno Brewing Company with the labels that we designed. They're slightly different now. They've redesigned them since, but basically we kept the information here and then all of our legal on the left and the branding in the middle. The branding effectively became the Hop Mountain logo, and then the type or the name of the brew that it is, and then the type of brew that it is. But with the same placement, even though throughout all of these labels, the designs are very, very different, the placement of everything is roughly the same, right? So if you see all of these on a shelf, I think that's the last, yeah. So if you see all these on a shelf as you're going through, the branding would be consistent throughout all of the labels, right? So you have that same placement, the same size, roughly. I mean, some of the names are a little bit different. Obviously, that one's a little bit longer, that one's shorter, that one's way longer, that one's shorter, etc. But generally, we've established that, not hierarchy, but we've established that sort of spacing or that design, that template, I guess, for lack of a better word there. So they can all have different treatments, but effectively you can tell that they're all related to each other by placement and relation. And then white space, we talked about this, negative space versus positive space, but it doesn't just have to do with like fully blank space. So if we look at these two examples, we talk about reflecting attitudes, how you want the sort of feel that you want a presentation to have. So we have this new face mask, whatever product it is, but to ease your aches and pains, blah, blah, blah. Is there one of these that sort of seems more relaxed than the other? Is the one on the left or the one on the right like a little bit more? Yeah. So by using this white space, on the left, we have these giant blocks of color. We have this heavy, big, bold font, right? It doesn't necessarily read as like relaxing, right? So by increasing the white space or the negative space, by using a smaller font, adjusting our tracking here to give that ease, a little bit more like literal and figurative breathing room, and using a smaller font and allowing more of this sort of calm image to show through rather than covering it up with these giant blocks, you get a lot more openness. You get a lot more of, I think, the feel that this particular product would want to project, right?
The one on the left looks like an old horror movie poster.
It kind of does, yeah. It does have that like vintage horror movie look. Yeah, it's got that very sort of, I don't know, if it was an art piece or something and a little bit different. It reminds me a lot of like the early Barbara Kruger pieces where she would have like, she worked a lot in black and red and like these big boxy, I can show you examples later, but that was more like intent for fine art creation rather than advertising in this case. But again, just by increasing the sort of figurative and literal breathing room, you've opened this up and you've made it appear a lot more relaxing, right? This is technically a use of negative space or white space. They've taken the same image and just by sort of framing out this color inspiration, just by framing it out with a simple square-ish rectangular element, they've now separated this one image to where you have, this is all negative space, and then this would be positive space using the same exact image, one image, and just framing it a little bit differently. So they've used effectively this rectangular or square element to create or to indicate positive negative space. And then the classic example, I think I showed this earlier in the semester, but the classic example of negative space within this logo, the arrow between the E and the X of FedEx, showing motion, movement, et cetera, but using that negative space as a more sort of direct design element.